Good afternoon. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to our witnesses testifying before us today. Thank you for being here. Before I begin, I would like to welcome the members of the full committee who are not permanent members of the subcommittee who are attending today. I ask unanimous consent that these committee members be permitted to participate in this hearing with the understanding that all sitting subcommittee members will be recognized for questions prior to those not assigned to the subcommittee. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent to include into the record all member statements and extraneous material for members of the committee unable to attend today's hearing and who have asked to include a statement for the record in lieu of attendance. Without objection, so ordered. This afternoon, this subcommittee plans to discuss the European Reassurance Initiative, or ERI, with representatives of the U.S. European Command, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Army. All have important roles in this initiative's development, implementation, and execution. The goal of this hearing is to assess how the Department has implemented the initiative since it was announced, authorized, and appropriated by Congress beginning in fiscal year 2015. We also seek to understand how the Department plans to execute the initiative through fiscal year 2017. We'd also like our witnesses to discuss the opportunities and challenges facing implementation within the current European security environment and how the initiative competes for resources among other critical priorities within the Department, including readiness. A military that is not ready to deploy cannot credibly serve as a deterrent against aggressive behavior. The Department of Defense does not have enough ships to maintain a constant presence in key waters. They don't have a large enough in-strength to support a permanent presence in Europe, and the Department's nuclear enterprise and missile defense systems are in dire need of modernization. The recent NATO Warsaw Summit underscored many security challenges that Europe faces today. Foremost of these challenges is a resurgent Russia. The Warsaw Summit provided the opportunity to help form a cohesive and comprehensive NATO plan to counter Russian actions using both conventional and unconventional methods, but there's much more to be done. Vigilant oversight and consistent evaluation will help ensure that the European Reassurance Initiative invests in the right areas and utilizes resources effectively and efficiently. From recent congressionally mandated reports submitted by the Department, it seems the Department of Defense's strategy, operations, and posture are evolving to adapt to the new security model in Europe. We must also address the important issue of funding the ERI. Currently, money for the initiative is requested annually through the Overseas Contingency Operations budget. While drawing from these funds provides near-term flexibility and responsiveness, relying on such year-to-year appropriations does not allow the Department of Defense to confidently plan or implement an evolving strategy in the region. The House passed fiscal year National Defense Authorization Act addressed part of this issue by reallocating $2.2 billion of the request into the base budget. In doing so, the House has demonstrated its enduring commitment to the success of the European Reassurance Initiative. So I look forward to discussing the Department's strategy and the issues I've outlined. But before I introduce the witnesses, I turn to the Oversight Investigations Subcommittee ranking member for any opening remarks that she would like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's hearing is about the ERI, a program to deter Russian aggression and reassure our European partners and allies of our commitment to their security and territorial integrity. We should have no doubt that Russia does indeed pose a threat, but this threat looks very different from the 1980s. We should be mindful of this difference and allocate our scarce resources accordingly. Recent events in Europe have underscored this threat. For example, Russia has occupied Crimea and has fomented the continuing separatist struggle in eastern Ukraine. Across Europe, and in particular along Russia's border, the threat of Russian intervention is on many people's minds. ERA began in fiscal year 2015 as a way to reassure our allies that we stand with them against these threats. If approved, ERI would shift focus to deterrence in fiscal year 2017. It would increase the U.S. presence in Europe, build partner capacity, improve infrastructure, and facilitate interoperability. Over half of ERI funding is for pre-positioning military equipment, which would reduce the reaction time needed for U.S. personnel to respond to urgent crises. I want to make sure programs like ERI take into account the current environment to deter Russian aggression in a sophisticated and measured way. Funding is expected to quadruple to $3.4 billion in FY 2017, so it's even more important that Congress provide effective oversight. We should also keep in mind threats like cyber and hybrid warfare. I'd want to ensure, in addition to the challenges addressed by ERI, we are assisting our allies to guard against less conventional tactics. In addition to our commitment, our NATO partners must do their part and work to increase their capabilities, presence, and defense spending. The best defense of Europe is a strong collective defense. At last week's NATO summit in Warsaw, NATO leaders underscored their commitment to unity. Finally, I'd like to know whether ERI achieves the right balance. Does it address the needs and requirements in Europe? And are we realistically looking at a long-term investment? I have concerns that the FY 2017 funding for this program is requested through the OCO. The OCO funding is generally considered to be a temporary war fund. It looks increasingly like the ERI is going to be a long-term program. It also seems like Russia's destructive influence and destabilizing efforts will continue for years to come. Given this, using OCO to pay for ERI is no longer appropriate. Further, what message does it convey to our allies when we put this, quote, reassurance, unquote, program into a temporary funding account? It doesn't seem very reassuring. As we evaluate ERI today, I want to ensure our investments is made in the right way with long-term strategic planning and oversight in mind, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Spear. I'm pleased to recognize our witnesses today. I want to thank them for taking the time to be with us. We have with us Major General David Allvin, the Director of Strategy and Policy at U.S. European Command. Ms. Rachel Ellehuus, Principal Director, Europe and NATO Policy, Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, and Mr. Tom Tyra, Chief of Global Force Planning in the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, Department of the Army. Thank you all for being with us. And so now we'll hear your opening statements. Major General Allvin, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Chairman Hartzler, Ranking Member Spear, and members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and discuss the European Reassurance Initiative, or ERI. I would also like to express my sincere thanks on behalf of my commander and the Department of Defense for your support of this important initiative over the past 3 years. We believe it's making a real difference. The strategic environment in Europe has changed drastically over the past 30 months. One of the key reasons for the growing instability has been Russian malign influence, coercion, and aggression against NATO allies and other partner nations. Since the illegal annexation of Crimea and the Russian activity in the Donbas region of Ukraine, the potential for Russia to further advance their military adventurism into NATO countries has demanded a strong response. We at U.S. European Command have been working to assure our allies that our commitment to Article 5 of the Atlantic Treaty is ironclad. The first 2 years of the European Reassurance Initiative were largely focused on assurance. To an extent, assuring our allies has a deterrent effect in and of itself. However, as we continue to see a malign influence and a Russia acting to upset international norms, we have transitioned beyond purely assurance. We are planning and executing activities designed to serve as a stronger deterrent to Russian aggression. The fiscal year 2017 ERI submission of $3.4 billion reflects this transition, and I would again like to thank the committee for its support. The rapid change in the security environment requires a prompt answer. ERI has provided the funding mechanism to respond quickly and effectively while the Department conducts the full analysis as to which of these requirements are enduring and which may be shorter-lived to provide the appropriate counter to Russian aggression. At U.S. European Command, we also understand that there are fiscal pressures facing all government budgets. One of our most foundational principles as we design, plan, and execute our ERI activities is to preserve the integrity of the program and ensure that we are being responsible stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. Through close coordination with our policy and comptroller leadership in the Department, as well as the responsive oversight provided by Congress, we will continue to provide effective deterrence and assurance measures to prevent a conflict in Europe, which could have the potential to spread to the homeland. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ellehuus.
Distinguished members of the committee, thank you also for the opportunity to discuss the U.S. European Reassurance Initiative, as well as some of the recent moves that NATO has taken under the Warsaw Summit. Prior to, but particularly since 2014, we've really felt acutely the changed security environment in Europe. Where previously European Command had been focused on theater security cooperation and support to other combatant commands, we now face a real threat in the European theater, whether it's to the east or to the south. And thanks to the help and the responsiveness of ERI, we've been able to respond rapidly to this changing security environment. We're working very closely with individual allies, with NATO, as well as within the U.S. government to reinforce our collective commitment to NATO Article 5. Since 2014, when we began ERI, we've moved from assurance to deterrence in step with the security environment, and looking forward to 2017, we will continue to move in that direction as Russia's provocation does not change. We've seen increased exercises, irresponsible behavior from the Baltics to the Black Sea, and we need to continue to move in step with that. I wanted to, rather than focus on the 5 lines of effort, which General Allvin has already highlighted, talk about how U.S. leadership in this regard is paying dividends. Europeans and NATO are stepping up. At the recent Warsaw Summit, Secretary General Stoltenberg was able to report and announce that a majority of allies had either halted or reversed downward trends in their defense spending, and for the first time since 2009, overall NATO defense spending had increased. These are positive trends. We see individual allies stepping forward, as witnessed by the enhanced forward presence, whereby alongside the U.S., the UK, Germany, and Canada will provide framework nation status in the 3 Balts and Poland. So we are seeing very positive signs that our leadership in this area is making a difference. That having been said, we need to continue to work at this, and the 3 challenges that I see post-Warsaw and as we continue to think about the future of ERI are, firstly, institutional adaptation. We need to find a way to make NATO more agile in terms of its decision-making, command structure, and defense planning. Secondly, defense investment, and that's not just monetary, but also in terms of political will. We need to encourage folks to continue to increase their defense spending and to support operations both within the European and transatlantic theater and further afield. And finally, we need to combat internal political challenges and resist those who seek to divide us or undermine the international security order. In these past 2 years and in the 50-plus years that NATO has existed, we've found one thing as the threats have evolved and the security environment has evolved, and that is that we're stronger together. So thank you for your support.
Thank you, Ms. Ellehuus. Mr. Tyra.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Spear, distinguished members, I thank you for the opportunity to explain the Army's contribution to the European Reassurance Initiative. I have provided a written statement. I'd ask that you put it into the record and we proceed to your questions.
So ordered. Thank you. All right, I very much appreciate each of your comments. Now I begin with some questions. So in February of this year, former commander of U.S. European Command, General Breedlove, noted in his posture statement that EUCOM has less than the minimum required personnel, equipment, and resources to accomplish our current theater strategy. Can you elaborate on these shortfalls that General Breedlove references, and will the ERI budget request mitigate some of these shortfalls and gaps? And are there any other additional resources that are needed to sufficiently support ERI? So, General, I'm going to start with you.
Well, yes, ma'am. And with the reference to the personnel, equipment, and resources, we find that within the European theater, we see a more aggressive Russia that is influencing on the periphery states of NATO. And so given the current correlation of forces that might exist in a conflict, specifically with the United States, we do not have nearly the forces we had after 25 years of the degradation of the forces in Europe. This has been understandable because there have been other national security priorities that obviously have taken precedence in other parts of the world. However, we find ourselves now with a smaller number of forces from all services, as well as the appropriate equipment in order to be able to field and to respond to any other Russian aggression. And I would say that what ERI has done is it has rapidly enabled us to reverse that trend. Specifically, when we look at our FY17 submission, we look at this heel-to-toe rotation. That is an additional Armored Brigade combat team that is able to make its way into theater with its equipment, full up and ready to train not only with our joint force in the United States forces, but also with our partners and allies to enhance interoperability. I would say that also the submission for the APS, or the Armored Preposition stocks, offers the opportunity for that additional equipment that can start to come closer to leveling the playing field, if you will. But understanding the resource-constrained environment that we're in, we are pleased with this submission in moving the right direction to be able to recover those resources and the manpower and the forces to be able to deter further Russian aggression. And if the deterrence succeeds, we won't have to, God forbid, get in a conflict. Thank you.
That would certainly be the goal. Do either one of you want to weigh in on that question, Ms. Ellehuus?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the unfortunate reality is that given today's security environment, demand continues to outpace supply. And the flexibility of funds such as ERI, really, and some of the training funds that you've provided us to build partner capacity, not just of allies, but also of partner, help us offset that fact. One of the other things I would like to highlight is how we offset our risk with our cooperation with allies and partners. So I think increasingly you are seeing the United States cooperating at a strategic level and at an operational level with NATO allies. So we've seen the French carrier Charles de Gaulle deploy in the Middle East to help us with some of our stress on our naval and maritime forces. We've seen cooperative arrangements to use one another's bases. And we've seen host nations stepping up. So when we send our forces to the Baltic states, host nations such as Poland and the Balts are stepping forward to provide that infrastructure and support. So as we realize that the demand outpaces the supply, we need to look and rely more heavily on our allies and partners to help us out.
Very good. Mr. Tyra?
Yes, thank you. So the ability to deploy, first in and of itself, will make the Army more capable of meeting its global requirements. The units that we deliver, though, will be decisive action trained, so we would consider they are ready to conduct operations. The ability to work with allies and partners and develop an interaction capability and a commonality of training and equipping and the ability to fight together is a bonus. And I think we would view this as actually building readiness higher than it is as we developed. And over time, the soldiers that make those rotations will come back better able.
Very good. Ms. Ellehuus, you discussed the recent NATO summit and some of the outcomes of that, and I think it is encouraging, the increased amount of resources that the countries are providing and their joint willingness to work with us on training and having that forward presence. But I just wondered, do you see any risk to NATO's cohesion? And if so, what are those potential risk there, and how should NATO's Article 5 and 6 commitments be applied in this highly ambiguous domain?
Thank you. Well, certainly there are a number of forces and actors who are trying to undermine alliance unity, but fortunately the Warsaw Summit was a representation of the fact that we're committed to collective defense and they won't be able to do that. So whether it's Russian propaganda in the Baltic states and Poland or in Central Europe, or it's provocative actions towards our ally Turkey, I think we have demonstrated through Warsaw and our commitments there to collective defense in Article 5 that we're going to be sticking together and we're not going to allow them to undermine that. I'm anticipating a question about Brexit, so I'll preempt it, but we have...
Please tell us about Brexit and your feelings on its impact.
We have a very close relationship, uniquely close relationship with the United Kingdom, and in anticipation of a yes or a no vote, we continued to reinforce that relationship in the days following the Warsaw Summit and the vote. The UK has reinforced its commitment to a number of important initiatives. So they have publicly committed at the Farnborough Air Show to their maritime patrol aircraft and the commitment to procure 9 P-8s. They've announced procurement of Apaches, and they've announced intent to move forward as quickly as possible. I believe it's the 18th of July with a debate on their continuous at-sea deterrence and that principle. So I think that while there are external forces that seek to divide, we've presented a united front, and that even given some of the trends that could undermine our ability to operate effectively and together, we have a strong enough base that I think we'll manage to weather the storm.
I cautiously say I think I'm optimistic or encouraged by some of the recent events and some of the things you just shared. So that's good news. I now turn to the ranking member, Representative Spear, for her questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General Allen, in your statement, you said that Russia employs multiple types of warfare, conventional, irregular, and asymmetric, to induce regional instability. How is the ERI going to improve our ability to defend against Russia's asymmetric tactics?
Thank you very much for that question. I would say two things. With respect to sort of the hybrid warfare, which is sort of one of the common terms, hybrid warfare is neither new or unique, but the way the Russians are applying it very effectively now is primarily below the conventional level. So I would say that the way that the European Reassurance Initiative approaches this is with our partners and allies, specifically in areas which are susceptible or have been susceptible to some of these hybrid tactics, whether they be information operations or propaganda or cyber attacks or these sort of things that sort of disrupt the internal governmental flow or the workings of the government. The European Reassurance Initiative has allowed us to have engagements in those countries. There's been some of the funding that's gone towards some of the cyber engagements that we can teach our tactics and procedures about attribution, about hardening and resilience with the cyber capabilities, about attributing not only the cyber attacks, but also some of the propaganda. So it really is an awareness and sharing the tactics and techniques that we use to be able to highlight those. But I would say that on the hybrid warfare, part of the hybrid is the high end, and that high end is the conventional conflict. And I would say that historically has proven to be the most costly and the most irreversible. And so if we can continue to reassure and now deter that conventional conflict, it at least sort of brackets it and allows us to work down in some of these lower areas of malign influence and coercion beyond the large conventional conflict. And so I think the ERI helps us both have a stronger deterrent effect against the conventional conflict, but there are elements that we're doing with engagement, resilience, and hardening that help against some of these elements of the lower echelons of hybrid warfare.
Major General, you had indicated to me privately that the troops that we will have stationed as part of ERI would be engaged in military exercises, and you had suggested that the numbers may be as high as 100 per year, some smaller, some larger. How many of these are air shows?
Ma'am, I actually wouldn't put an air show in the
Good.
category of exercises. When we refer to these exercises, and when I say 100, some of these are small, maybe company-level exercises. But these are building that understanding, that cohesion at the unit level. And I would say those are the most prolific. However, with the initial funding we've been able to receive through ERI, we're able to have exercises at the larger level, the battalion level and above, which really help us understand the interoperability between formations, because we understand that U.S. European Command will not be the sole entity that will have to defend against Russian aggression. We will be fighting with our allies and partners in the region. And so these broader exercises, these higher level exercises really enhance that confidence to be able to fight and maneuver and do combined arms warfare beyond just the United States, but in the coalition.
Mr. Tyra, what type of military equipment do you expect to be deployed over the next 5 years as part of the ERI?
So in the next year, we intend to build an armored brigade combat team. If supported, we intend to build a fires brigade, which is artillery, which would be tube and rocket artillery, to add to it. We intend to build a division headquarters battalion, which is the equipment that the division commander and his staff use, approximately 500 soldiers, so it'd be, computers, radios, satellite communication, vehicles, that kind of stuff, to allow them to conduct mission command throughout the region. And that'll be 2017. If the program continues, we would look to meet the next identified requirements for the defense of Europe, and I think you would expect to see engineering battalions moved over there. I think you'd expect to see possibly the ground element of an Army Aviation Brigade. I think we would want to see more satellite communication, more logistics, and whatever was required to speed the delivery of a fighting force.
So in terms of actual weapons to be warehoused over there in the next year, we're not talking about a sizable number of weapon systems being transferred over there? I was under the impression that that's what we were doing.
So in the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team, you would see 80 M1 tanks and 140 Bradley fighting vehicles, 18 artillery systems, a number of mortar systems and smaller pieces of equipment. So we would end up with that plus the support vehicles that enable that to fight. Then there would be a rotating brigade that would bring identical sets of equipment. As you delivered the fires brigade, you would expect another 100 or so artillery systems, either tube or rocket launched, to be added to that fires brigade.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ellehuus, this is an example of mission creep. I might actually be supportive of this, but this started out as a $1 billion emergency fund for 1 year, and now it is morphing into a $3.4 billion program that, for all intents and purposes, is becoming permanent. What do you see the funding levels growing to in subsequent years?
Well, certainly we are aware of this tension between things that are paid for through supplementary funding as opposed to things that are part of our regular base budgets. And when we vet the requests that come through from the services and the combatant commands, we take a very close look at those to make sure that we are not funding enduring requirements indefinitely. And over time, we too would like to see more things move into the base, not least because, as all of you have said, it provides a degree of certainty to our allies and partners that our commitment is enduring rather than year to year. In terms of future year budgets, I mean, we do have to plan against a baseline. So, I would anticipate that we would plan against last year's baseline as a going-in proposition and then adjust from there. But we don't want to come in every year and asking you to double this amount. We do need to continue to protect the integrity of the program and take a close eye at what's being proposed and what fits with what we need to respond to the strategic environment and whether we're using the right sources of money.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Now we go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ellehuus, this is somewhat of an opinion question, I recognize, but something that I ask myself, and just Russia's economy today, the impact that it has on Putin's decision-making process and how aggressive he is. The weakness in his economy could lead him to be more aggressive. It could lead him to be less aggressive. What is your opinion on that, whether or not he's less aggressive or more aggressive because of his current economic state, and what happens if the price of oil returns where his economy actually recovers?
Thank you for your question. Yes, it's certainly a difficult balance to determine whether we want a strong Russia or an internally destabilized Russia. So when we think about things like sanctions and oil prices, certainly instability in Russia is a concern, as well as external provocation. It's hard to say exactly when I look at what causes a reaction from Mr. Putin and what does not. It seems like we can try to get into his mind and guess at what is an excuse for provocation, but I don't think that he necessarily needs one. I take the example example of two recent exercises that we had in Europe. We had Anaconda just here in the beginning of June, which with 31,000 soldiers from 24 nations. We also had Baltop 16, which has been happening for decades, and that had about 6,100 soldiers, and it's something that the Russians have been invited to previously, they're aware of, and of the two exercises, he griped about Baltops rather than Anaconda. So it's hard to get into the mindset and sort of determine what would be provocative and destabilizing, but I think in the first instance, we need to make sure that we're doing the best to make sure that we deter his aggression and that we're prepared if that deterrence fails.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that maybe his perception of weakness on the other side may be more of a determining factor than how strong he is internally or his country is financially.
Yes, I think an outward show of strength is something that reinforces domestic support for his leadership. And so if there is an opportunity or an opening to demonstrate that resolve against NATO or individual allies, I think we've seen he's an opportunist and will take that initiative.
But if that outward show has the more risk that outward show has, the less likely that he is to engage in it, then would that be a fair statement?
Could you please repeat that?
So the less likely he is to, the more strength there is on the other side of it, the less likely he would be willing to engage in those provocative behaviors.
Yes, I think that is certainly our intent with the moves we're trying to take under ERI and in a NATO context. Earlier, resilience was mentioned, and if you build resilience in a country and you give them options, so for example, if Putin thinks one of the tools at his disposal is cutting off energy supplies in the Baltic states or the Black Sea, he'll use that. But if there is kind of a safety net and an alternative, it undermines his ability to hold them at risk. So demonstrating strength is certainly a way to change that calculus and make the costs outweigh the risks.
And so this helps get to my point, which may be contradictory respectfully to another colleague's point. If we have a short-term commitment, he can simply wait us out. Or if we show a long-term commitment, then maybe he doesn't feel like maybe he's not as froggy as we'd say in
Right.
South Georgia, if you will.
It's difficult to know, sir.
What other plans, other than the European Reassurance Initiative, does the DoD have to deter Russia over the long term?
Well, I know that we have a number of classified programs, which we'd be happy to come back and to discuss in another forum, that try to look at some of Russia's capabilities and the military buildup that they've undertaken in recent years and how we might get at that. For example, I think you're all very familiar with the third offset strategy and some of the efforts we're trying to take to think about how we change the way we approach conventional capabilities and make sure we retain the military edge. So that is definitely one thing. Also, I would say that, in addition to European Command, we have to remember that other combatant commands have a role in deterring Russia. So I know that Northern Command is looking very closely at the Arctic and what Russia's doing in the Arctic and trying to make sure that while we keep that stable and safe and demilitarized, we are not being naive about what Russia's intentions there. Similarly, PACOM has a role to play. If you're on the West Coast, that's how you're looking at the Russia threat. So there are a number of initiatives underway across the department.
My time's expired, but Madam Chair, I hope we have time for a second round of questions.
Yes, I do too. Thank you. Now we turn to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate it, and thank you all very much for being here today. Please pardon my lack of knowledge in this area, but what is Russia doing in the Arctic?
Well, certainly they have a presence there, and a great part of their territory is in the Arctic. So a lot of that presence is legitimate. It's economic interests, and as we see new seaways opening up, I think they're thinking ahead to the economic opportunities, but also to being able to control those lanes and passageways. So in addition to military buildup in the Baltic Sea region, we are seeing some changes in military buildup in the Arctic as well, increased exercises and presence that we hadn't seen to date. So while some of the presence is certainly legitimate and in defense of their economic and legitimate interests, some of it is a little bit worrying given that in the Arctic Council and other fora, we've really tried to focus on keeping that a conflict-free zone and keeping it stable.
Anything else to add by the other two panelists?
Ma'am, I would just add the one sort of exclamation point on that is, beyond their legitimate interests, I forget how many years ago, but they did take the sort of the rhetorical point of placing a platinum Russia flag on the northern pole, sort of staking their claim to the very north pole, part of the Arctic. So there is some rhetoric that's sort of this sort of a bullying type of behavior that's consistent with how they approach things.
Thank you, and I think that segues nicely into my next question, Putin as a bully, and how we deal with that type of a personality, the uncertainty that he presents, because we never know what he's going to do. He's capable of anything. So I'd like you all to address that. How do we deal with someone of the personality type of a Putin?
Ma'am, I'll take the first shot at that. And the smarter people to my right and left will probably be able to improve on that. But that is a question that we ask ourselves continuously. And I think absent being able to get into the mind of Mr. Putin, which none of us have been able to, I think that we go back to the principles, I guess, of deterrence, when in fact we look at the principles of what we need to do to prevent certain behavior or unacceptable behavior from a certain actor. And the deterrence theory really says that if you want to prevent that behavior, you need to do a couple of things. You either need to convince that potential doer of adversarial actions that the outcome that they seek will not be attainable, they will not achieve the benefit that they perceive they're going to achieve by that, or in the pursuit of that, the cost will be so high that it will not be worth that benefit they anticipate they're going to gain. And so that really is the traditional deterrence paradigm. So if you perceive him as a bully, or if you perceive him as a confident, aspirant, great power leader, however you do that, we judge his actions, and we look at what the potential actions would be that would be adversarial to our national security interests, and then what are the things we can do to either make it that perception that it's unattainable or the cost of attaining will be too high. And so that's really at the heart of really what the ERI really is. It starts with assurance, where we're showing that we have a stake in the game, perhaps greater than Putin's Russia believed that we did. And so for the first couple of years, we were assuring our European allies we're going to be there. Our commitment to Article 5 is ironclad. Now, as we're showing we have a better interoperability with them, we're putting more credible combat formations in there, we're showing that cohesion. Now we're looking at trying to convince Putin's Russia that this is going to cost more than you think, and your ambitious behavior here may be met with the cost that you may not want to incur for your particular adventurism. So we really just fall back on the principles of deterrence as really the foundation for some of the activities we're doing in ERI, whether it's a bully or whatever you see him as.
Thank you.
I often think of sort of, child-rearing metaphors in context to international relations, so I very much appreciate the question. I think first and foremost, we need to demonstrate unity. So whether it's on sanctions or, just trying to pick off individual allies, I think that's the worst thing we can do, is allow him to separate us from one another. We just have to demonstrate that resolve and unity. I actually think the administration's policy of a strong and balanced approach to Russia is very wise, because one of the things that Putin seeks is influence. He wants to matter. He wants a seat at the table. But in order to coerce that behavior in the right direction, where it's supporting rather than undermining the international system, we cooperate with them in areas where they're being a constructive actor. So you reward the good behavior while punishing the bad. Again, going back to the child care metaphor.
My kids would be appalled to hear me say this open hearing, but that approach does work. And thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Let's move on to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell.
And thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to join your committee today, and thank you, panel, for being here. It's good to see Mr. Tyra. It's been many, many years, and General Allvin, it's good to see you again. We've had suggestions here today of mission creep, but I recall when I joined the military in the mid-1980s, in Europe we had 2 full corps of soldiers. That would have been a minimum of 4 total divisions and 2 armored cavalry regiments, not to mention air forces and other allies. So this is not a mission creep. This is staunching the bleed out of a presence to virtually nothing now in Europe. It calls to mind that deterrence without a deterrent is a bluff that gambles the future security of Europe. So I guess my question to the 3 of you is, how reassuring would it be to Europe if we don't have a deterrent? If we don't build this contingency force, what would the reaction be in that scenario?
Well, thanks for the question. I think it's, again, it's trying to predict an unknown, but I would say that that history has shown that if one seeks to split the alliance or a set of individual nations, then one can show how perhaps the team is not all playing together. And so, to your point, the lack of showing our commitment in presence, our commitment in interoperability, our commitment in training and exercises to show that we are a cohesive, credible combat force. I think logic would dictate that would have a negative effect on the alliance's confidence in its ability to fight as an alliance and repel Russian aggression.
Can I preempt you? So I again am reassured by some of the language in the communique from the Warsaw Summit. NATO focused very much on deterrence and defense and how to reinforce that, even if we don't have the volume of forces and capabilities in theater that we had previously. And the way that they put it is they underscored that collective defense is a fundamental responsibility of NATO, and it relies on a whole suite of capabilities. So it's a mix of the nuclear, the conventional missile defense, and increasingly even cyber and space and other elements. So even if we don't have the heft of conventional forces that we had, I'm hopeful that the way we think creatively about the mix of capabilities enables us to get at the problem and to deter.
So I would add to that, the U.S. has a long history of displaying the ability to deploy enormous resources against a problem, and that raising the determination in the U.S. and its allies is not profitable, right? And therefore, you can, in fact, deploy that entire force and keep deploying it without having to build more of it. The economies in Europe, the U.S. economy, they're all capable of conducting these operations. And I think that is how we would tell them. What they need is assurance from that the U.S. is with them, and then that would be enough.
Well, thank you for that. And I guess my last question would be, what impact would it have on other nations? We've made much of the initiative to encourage our European allies to provide 2% towards their national defense, and we see some movement on that. Some is mixed. A lot of it is tied to a lot of factors. If we lead and show from no presence to now a brigade combat team with the promise of, as you suggest, Mr. Tyra, that as we show up, there's more to follow. You may pick on little brother today, but big brother is coming. If we don't do that, what impact would that have on the 2% initiatives that we've worked so carefully to try to craft with our European allies to make their own commitments?
I can begin since you took the last one. Certainly it's a fine balance between being there and being a good NATO ally and doing our part while not allowing unequitable burden sharing. So I think a good example of this is the enhanced forward presence. The U.S. actually did not commit to be a framework nation until we were pretty certain that other allies were going to step up. And it goes with this thinking that, you know, Europeans should also be taking responsibility for their security and caring about it as much as we care about the transatlantic space. So enhanced forward presence is an example of how the U.S. was careful not to underwrite everything, because we'd already done quite a bit through ERI. On 2%, I think we do need to keep the pressure on. Again, 5 allies have stepped up and are now at or above 2%, and others are on their way. But we regularly in our office have people coming through and telling us that we need to keep the pressure on because they need to be able to go back to their parliaments and argue for greater defense spending and why it is central to stability, economic stability in their countries.
And thank you for that, and I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now we turn to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to join the hearing today. I'd love to follow up on Mr. Russell's point. We've talked a lot today about deterrence and about the money that we are committing towards that end. But I think it would also send a very powerful message for our NATO allies to meet their commitments in terms of proximity to Russia itself, to the threat that potentially presents. They have the most to lose in a confrontation, and it blows me away that of the 28 NATO member countries, only 5 have met a minimal threshold of 2%, while we're spending near 4%, double all other NATO countries combined. And of the Baltic states, only Estonia has reached that. The Baltic states, who we seem to be preoccupied with in terms of potential Russian provocation. And so my concern, I don't know if you have an answer to it, you said that we are pretty certain that some of these member countries are going to meet their commitments. We need to do more. If you have something specific to share, I'd love to hear it. If not, I'd just love to make the point that we are creating a moral hazard by upping an investment from $789 million to $3.4 billion without a concurrent commitment in real dollars or euros from our allies on the continent. And I think that sets its own set of problems in motion. The other thing that I'd like to ask of General Allvin is, last week we had a great panel, including Dov Zakim, who talked about the tyranny of consensus. And you have been talking about all the reasons that ERI makes sense, everything that it might be able to do. I'd love to get a sense of the intellectual rigor that went into making these decisions and coming up with this strategy, in much the same way that we may or may not have been able to forecast that Russia might feel encircled as we brought more countries formerly in the Eastern Bloc into NATO. Is there some unintended consequence that we might want to think about now, or that you could share with us in terms of upping our commitment, our force structure, the amount of money that we're spending, ratcheting up the escalation in that area? Again, maybe for the right reasons, maybe we've thought all of this through, but assure me that you've thought through some of the other consequences that may not have been obvious from your testimony.
Well, sir, I would say specifically with respect to the approach that we've taken. As I mentioned, there's been a transition for the first couple of years was really about assurance. And so if one wanted to say that was a more passive approach, because when you looked at the way that we were executing and have been executing, it was very disaggregated with our formations. And it was sort of a statement that we're here. We're here, but the way that we were here in many of the presence in the Baltics, for example, was not necessarily a credible combat formation, but it sent that message that we're standing next to our allies. And as we saw the continued malign influence in the activities, that's what has had us step up.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have really limited time, so I'm not so interested in the thinking that went into coming up with this as the strategy, but the thinking that challenged this strategy. What are the potential risks of this strategy? What could go wrong?
So you actually touched on it very well, Congressman, is that there's an escalation risk here. And so as we try and understand those things which are true red lines, those things which are rhetorical red lines, the consistency is with our commitments of resources and equipment and exercises and increased focus in Europe it's also with the consistent messaging, the messaging of what we're here to do and what the objectionable behavior by the Russians that has caused this response.
From my perspective as a member of Congress, Crimea caught me by surprise. And again, from a little bit of a distance, although I sit on the committee and I've been able to be in some classified discussions on this, I think all of us would have liked to have known more about what was about to come before it hit us. Tell me what, since Crimea, you have done in terms that you can talk about here, in terms of maybe Russian language specialists who are on your staff, your ability to collect information, the ability not just through deterrence and force presence, but perhaps the non-force aspects of what we do in Europe to prevent something from happening in the first place or to anticipate it before it hits us. And I didn't leave you much time, so I may have to take this for the record, Madam Chair.
And I'll introduce, and perhaps I'll get a chance to expound on it later, but the Russian Strategic Initiative is something I'd like to share and talk about, which is, of course, with respect to the intel capabilities, I'm not of that particular ilk, but I know that there are more intel professionals who can speak more deeply on this, but they are committed to regaining that expertise in the quantities that have sort of eroded over the past 15, 20 years for the right reasons, because there are more global requirements for that. But that is a commitment that the intel community is making. The Russia Strategic Initiative is, much of it is about learning. It's about understanding. So to your point, sir, that the surprise of Crimea, that caught us, a lot of us, sort of unawares, and understanding that we need to be able to have a better understanding of the thinking, of the strategy, of the doctrine of Russia, to be able to anticipate better. In conjunction with the increasing resources from the intelligence community, we have an understanding to how to respond to those and perhaps get ahead of that. So I'd be happy to talk at further length about the Russia Strategic Initiative, which is something that incidentally was initially funded through ERI.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You bet. And we're getting ready to start here in a minute, second round of questioning. So if you can stick around, I'd love to have you have the opportunity to share any more questions you might have, because those are really, really excellent questions. Representative Moulton?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's great to be here. First of all, I just want to associate myself with Representative Russell and Representative O'Rourke and their remarks about the importance of contributions to the NATO alliance. You emphasized how important it is that we have a united alliance. General, you used terms commitment and presence, confidence in the alliance, effectiveness of interoperability. Do you think it would be a wise decision to dismantle NATO?
No. Absolutely not. I could go on for minutes or hours, but absolutely, if NATO.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here. We unfortunately have a major party candidate who thinks that's a good idea. You also talked about the importance of deterring Putin, and I couldn't agree more that he is a real threat. Is it helpful to have people talking about his leadership, praising his military accomplishments? Is that a good way to deter Putin, General?
I can really only speak to the way that we can try and avert behavior through our strength and sort of the primary deterrence theory model with respect to other influences outside of the principles of deterrence, which are deny the benefit or increase the cost. I'm not really a deterrence specialist beyond the principles of deterrence theory, so I really can't speak to those elements.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that?
We work with alliances and partnerships every day, so we see the value of those. And the transatlantic community, Putin aside, when we have other nations who are undermining the rules-based international order, which we've tried so hard to create, I think the transatlantic community has greater influence together. And so outside of a NATO perspective, I think in terms of relative influence, there's a rationale for keeping NATO and increasing our relationship with individual allies and the EU.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to talk about something that some other people have brought up, which is the Russian hybrid warfare threat and how we're meeting that threat. When I was in Eastern Europe looking at the threat of Russia last year, it was very clear that we've gotten, we're doing some good tank drills and things like that, but Russia has an incredibly well-developed propaganda effort, for example. Extensive propaganda, both clandestine but also, frankly, very public with their public TV stations. One of the lessons that we've learned in fighting ISIS over the past several years is that we can drop a lot of bombs and kill a lot of ISIS fighters, but if we don't address the recruiting effort, either right there on the ground amongst the family and friends of those we kill, or through the internet with folks even back home, then we're really not going to win this fight against ISIS. And it strikes me that there's a bit of an analogy with the fight against Russia, that we can add a few more battalions of tanks and do some larger tank drills and shows of force with our Air Force. But if we're not addressing the way that they are really undermining confidence in the NATO alliance right there in Eastern Europe, then we're probably not going to win this fight in the long run. So, General, can you talk about the balance that you see in the ERI and whether we're putting enough effort into those types of battles as well?
Well, I would say that balance of effort does not necessarily equate to balance of dollars.
Sure.
So I think that there are some areas that are smaller dollar amounts within ERI, and some of the things that we're doing just within the normal conduct of business with our Special Operations Command in Europe that really get at this, using the host nation to strengthen their ability to attribute, to be able to sort of call out, to be able to identify that which is true with that which is being, formulated, the facts on the ground. I think inherently you step back and it's easy to understand how a country that acts fully out of interest versus a country which is value-based has an advantage tactically in being able to not be encumbered by the truth. However, so it makes it a bit of a challenge, but that one I think we embrace happily as a values-based nation. So I think those sort of things that we're doing to be able to help them attribute it, confront it, call them out, and be able to identify the differences between the truth and what's being portrayed. That is being funded partially through ERI and some of the engagements that we do in a day-to-day business within European.
Do you think it's being funded sufficiently?
Honestly, I am not enough of an expert to say.
I mean, my
what that next
impression
dollar
a
would
year
buy.
ago was that we're doing very little compared to what they're doing to counter their effort. So I mean, if there's been a dramatic change in the last 12 months, then I'd be willing to revise my assessment. But
I would offer that as we look at this, it's not necessarily the Russian military alone that is doing this. So as they're approaching it whole of government, whole of nation approach.
And
something.
Do we have enough of a whole of nation, whole of government approach in response?
I would say that's beyond my particular area of expertise.
From your perspective, do you think you are being supported enough? I mean, you have a job that's very dependent on these other arms of government. Mm-hmm. Do you think we're doing enough?
I honestly, understanding the tensions that exist within this government for all the things that have to be done, I cannot speak credibly as to what the other elements of the government are doing, whether it's sufficient.
So, General, if you cannot even speak to what the other elements of government are doing, it certainly doesn't give me much confidence that we have enough of a whole of government approach to this threat. So, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as has been alluded to in this initiative for fiscal year 17, we are funding the operation at $3.4 billion, which is up from $789 million authorized and appropriated last year. So that's a huge increase in investment. And the request directs most of those funds towards a conventional buildup, including consecutive rotational or heel-to-toe deployments of U.S. troops and the pre-positioning of an armored brigade combat team's equipment in Europe. And the funds also are providing for additional military exercises with one or more foreign partners, building foreign military capacity, countering unconventional threats, and military construction or MILCON projects. So just for the record, could you expound on specific examples of way this money is being used, specific MILCON projects that are going to be using this money, specific training exercises that you've been doing, and examples of building that foreign military capacity? So, General?
Yes, ma'am. Well, I would say specific with starting with the exercises. That's one we alluded to earlier with whether it be Anaconda 16 or the ball tops or cold response, Trident juncture. These are elements of exercising that we're enabling to grow and be more multinational and more opportunities to test interoperability amongst nations. So that's on the exercise. It's been very robust. The infrastructure, when we talk about MILCON, it's not necessarily what we would consider a big construction. It's a very small percentage, but the military construction is really to allow the infrastructure of the host nation to better support their training and our training needs alongside them. So when you have slight improvements, for example, in training ranges in Bulgaria, for example, that allows us to have a better bilateral, multilateral exercises and training interoperability exercises, given the improvements in the ranges, for example. With respect to the presence, I would say that each of these 5 lines of effort, the key is that this is one area where the sum is much greater than the parts. If you have this sort of slight increase in the infrastructure, it enables you to do more robust exercising. If you have a greater presence of this Armored Brigade Combat Team, which is there heel to toe fully with their equipment, it allows you to do more broader engagements and interoperabilities and leverage the small infrastructure improvements that we're doing. As you increase the engagements with your partners at the smaller level with building partnership capacity, that's done through the presence and the engagements of those forces that are able to come over. And in a purely deterrence aspect, which is really what the preposition stocks, largely a deterrent aspect, but they also enable the Army to, in future times, come over and fall in on that and be able to exercise that as a deterrent. So each of those really feed into each other for an overall increased deterrent effect.
Very good. As we discussed privately, you'll be modernizing some of the bunkers and some of the old facilities that are there in order to house the equipment and to be able to have those pre-positioned stocks. What can we expect our allies to contribute to the ERI from both a capability and capacity perspective? And separately, would the U.S. foreign military sales programs be a useful mechanism through which the U.S. could aid our ERI partners? And if so, are there any FMS cases that are currently working their way through the FMS process relating to this initiative in our partner nations?
I can begin on that. Certainly, you know, as we've moved from assurance to deterrence, and we've learned more each year as we've proceeded with the training and exercises and other efforts under ERI. So, for example, as we do the training and exercises, we find other vulnerabilities in terms of maneuverability or movement or gaps in infrastructure or communications, and so we're able to build on that. And those aren't just vulnerabilities that we, the United States, needs to come in and fix. Those are lessons learned that we pass on to individual allies about their vulnerabilities and what they need to do to reinforce their own defense. And there are things that we pass on to NATO as well. So to give you one example, you're probably familiar with NATO's RAP, or Reassurance Action Plan, which was a holdover from Wales Summit in 2014. And the NAC recently agreed the Readiness Action Plan reception, staging, and onward movement and pre-position capability packages, whereby NSIP funding, about 300 million euros, will be used to support ERI projects, so design and construction, including storage of U.S. equipment in Poland. So this is, you know, it's a lot of words, but in short, you know, we have said we want to pre-position stocks in Poland, and we want to train there, and NATO is recognizing that they'll take advantage of those sites as well. And so they recognize that NATO will also provide funding for that. So that heavily reduces the bill for the U.S. and allows us to either give back that ERI funding or use it elsewhere. And so I give you that example just to show the kind of expectations we are conveying not only to individual allies in terms of host nation support, but to NATO, saying you're benefiting from this as well. You're going to use those training regions. You're going to use those bases. In terms of your second question about building partner capacity and FMF, I would have to get back to you because we'd need to confer with State Department about what the security assistance plan is for this year. But I do know that in the discussions that DoD has been involved in with State Department about building that program, we have argued for pooled funding for the Baltic nations to increase their capabilities under the Baltic Defense Capabilities Initiative, particularly in areas such as air defense. And so we've tried to look at them as as three rather than individual nations and look at what they already have and what they might need in future to reinforce their own defenses using mechanisms like FMF. But we can certainly take that for the record and get you exact numbers for FMF.
Appreciate that. Yeah, this subcommittee has been looking at the foreign military sales process and ways that it is impacting our global defense and as well as any problems. So that's why I asked that question. My last question before I turn to the other members is, given the information coming out of Eastern Europe, I understand that there are very lethal threats to our primary ground combat platforms and their crews. And many in the Army, including General McMaster, the director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center and Deputy Commander General of Futures at the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, has stated that our ground combat vehicles are losing their qualitative edge over our adversaries. With Russia demonstrating the capability to field advanced anti-tank weapons and thermobaric warheads, our armored vehicles and service members will be vulnerable in a fight. So I understand that new technologies like the Active Protection System, the APS, can defeat these threats. And they have already been successfully fielded and combat tested by our allies with great results. I've been a very strong advocate of APS technologies to protect our men and women and believe we need the technology fielded now. So, General Allvin, can you tell us how EUCOM in particular views the threat situation to our ground combat vehicles, and how is EUCOM working with the Army to address the threat sooner rather than later, especially if the APS solution already exists?
Well, I will tell you that what we're learning as like we mentioned, this last 30 months has been, it's relatively rapid, I guess, in bureaucratic time frame. But we have been getting smarter about what it takes to operate and in the vicinity of, and what combat might look like if, God forbid, it were to actually happen through some of our contingency planning and wargaming. And that actually has yielded deficiencies in several domains. So it's not only just the land domain, but the air domain, their ability to inhibit the freedom of movement and the qualitative edge sort of waning in several areas. So while I can't speak to this specifically, what we do as a result of that, those are the capability gaps and shortfalls that we do submit in each of those domains, those shortfalls as they're identified and clarified to the department, and that goes back to the services and into the building to come up with the solutions to those. So we do identify the gaps and the shortfalls, and then the solutions come out through OSD and the services. And I would say that this particular one has not elevated above others to us. There is a general category of inhibitors to freedom of movement and things where the qualitative edge has waned with respect to a potential confrontation with the Russians.
I'm having a classified briefing tomorrow on some of these issues, so perhaps we can delve further into those vulnerabilities at that time. But thank you for your answer. Ranking Member Spear, do you have any additional questions? Very good. Mr. Scott, do you have any additional questions? No.
General Allvin, I want to follow up, and this may give you a chance to speak about the initiative you were talking about earlier. Just kind of what requirements remain unfunded under the current budget? How would you assess the risk that that causes the forces under European Command? And then just any general comments that you have. I know you had some comments about the Russian initiative.
Well, thank you. I would say that in general, we do need those forces that are coming in through ERI, those increased rotational forces. And I think one of the other areas that's been identified is also, as we mentioned, the ability to counter this anti-access area denial capability that the Russians have been able to put up that could inhibit the freedom of movement. That's about as much depth at this classification. But I would say that thank you for the opportunity to reengage on the Russia Strategic Initiative, because one thing we certainly understand is that we do have some learning to do, and we have to do it fairly rapidly. And so while the intelligence community is really working hard on being able to increase the robustness and the capacity of their resources and their analysts and the understanding, we also in the department understand that this is an issue that crosses combatant commands, and it is something that we need to understand as a department. And so thanks to initially the funding of the European Reassurance Initiative, we have developed this Russia Strategic Initiative. And it is, I can tell you at this classification level, its primary role is to enhance our understanding and to help support some of the planning that we would do and some of the deterrent activities. So as a lot of these questions that have been asked today that we're still trying to get to the correct answers on, the Russia Strategic Initiative is moving us closer to a better understanding that will help us be able to have more satisfying answers to questions like this in the future. And I would say that this is an example as we look at the question of what is in the OCO, which should be into base. This is one of those that the department realizes this is a long-term initiative. And so it has been transitioned into a program of record. So the funding that started off in ERI is going to transition into the Army's base budget as a program of record. So this is one of the examples where we keep analyzing those things that we think are going to be long-term requirements and how we might be able to move them into the base budgets. So thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Do you think that Mr. Putin underestimated the global response with his actions in the Ukraine?
That is a very difficult question. It's a great question, and I think that there are many competing scholars who have different opinions as to whether he achieved some level of success and is satisfied with that at this point. There are others who will say that he was surprised, that he did not anticipate the level of national unity that actually post-Crimea that actually came against him when he went into the Donbass. I will say that is still an open question at this point. But as we look at the future, we do understand something about Russia, that they are learning an adaptive country. This is not the Soviet Union of old. And so as you look at the tactics and techniques and what they've been doing, starting with Georgia in 2008 up to now, they are learning and adapting. The question of what they're learning from Ukraine is, I believe, is still an open one, and I can't give you a good solid answer on that.
Do either of you have an opinion on that you'd like to share?
I think he certainly underestimated the resolve that coming out of NATO. I mean, the increase in defense spending and the refocus on deterrence and defense, that's really energized the alliance at a time when I think some countries were certainly sitting back and looking for further peace dividend. It's woken up a lot of people. I think of the example of Germany in particular, which has always played a pretty calm role in arbitrating between kind of Europe and Russia. And Chancellor Merkel speaks Russian and has a long history there, and so thought she had an understanding of where he was coming from, but clearly a lot of countries woke up and realized that you can't handle.
They also have very strong trade relationships with Germany, as I understand it, and I would think that would lead to maybe part of the surprise that he had from
certainly.
Her
but Germany in particular has been very strong on sanctions, with Chancellor Merkel leading the charge in their rollover each and every time and focusing on the importance of Minsk implementation. Other nations haven't been as strong, but she's been a real champion of that, despite the damage it's done to Germany's economy.
So I'd observe that every action that has been taken has resulted in an action that is unhelpful to them. And so the more times they push, the harder it gets. And I think a reaction is they're only making the coalition stronger. They're only making the NATO stronger. And I think they'll eventually get to that point. I would observe that Germany, among others, is one of the framework nations for the EFP. And so I think it's clear where they believe their future lies.
Well, we certainly, every member of this committee is aware of the challenges of what is in OCO that we would prefer to be in base, and something that we look forward to resolving as time goes forward. I would make one final point, which is certainly he saw where our NATO allies increase their defense spending, and he can also see when we reduce our defense spending. And I think that maybe leads to a false perception of weakness of the United States and our resolve. With that, Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you. General Allvin, going back to the line of questions about unintended consequences or thinking through next order effects of some of the decisions we're making today, we increase our force size in Europe and the amount that we're spending there. Ideally, Russia gets the message, it deters them from provocation or doing things that we don't or the Europeans don't want them to do. What if Russia increases its force size with its border with NATO? To Ranking Member Spear's question in terms of anticipating the budgetary consequences of this, do we see you back here or someone from the Pentagon 2 years from now saying, look, we thought $3.4 billion was going to do the trick. It turns out the Russians have put 2 more divisions here. We need to step up. You can understand my concern along this trajectory. Tell me how you have addressed that concern for yourself or for others in the Pentagon.
Well, certainly our role in U.S. European Command is to be able to identify sort of the demand as we see it to be able to counter security threats in Europe. So to the extent that, and I certainly wouldn't be able to predict what might happen in the coming years. I think our role here is to ensure that the money that we're being given now, we are spending it in the most efficient and effective manner to where we are actually increasing the power of the alliance, increasing the power of not just the United States forces over there, but the interoperability that and what we're learning from our training and exercises is making the entire alliance stronger. And if we succeed at that, then in fact, the likelihood of coming back and whether that comes back or makes it through the department, because that's actually what we do. We compete with all the other combatant commands to say, this is what we see in our AOR. I think the more successful we are in utilizing the resources we have now to help build the alliance and build that unity, that the less likely it is that that you'll see us here, in a couple years.
So success would be we've calibrated this correctly. We've spent the right amount. We've put the precise number of forces there to get the desired outcome. Failure would be the Pentagon coming back or a future administration coming back and saying, actually, we didn't quite get this right. It looks like the Russians have escalated. We now need to, in turn, escalate. Let me ask you, just because of limited time, as we bring more U.S. forces into this region and as the Russians respond in kind, I think we increase the opportunities for miscalculation. You mentioned your efforts towards ensuring that we do a better job of gathering intelligence and are just smarter and more effective with the resources that we have there. Talk about military-to-military cooperation with Russia, your relationships with your counterpart or your counterparts in Russia, and your ability to talk to each other to ensure that we don't have a miscalculation that leads to an unintended conflict or war.
I'm going to actually probably yield that second to my policy counterpart, but I would just say quickly on the first, I don't know that I would calculate that failure would be necessarily that we come back here. It might be a failure to predict. And so whether there are certain things that they say the enemy gets a vote, so the failure to predict exactly what an unpredictable Russia would do could actually result in us coming back. So there are many things that we don't fully have control over. We're going to focus on the things we do have control over to make sure that, again, we're making the best use of the resources that you're providing for us. I'll actually turn it over with respect to the mill-to-mill policy to Rachel.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think when we look at these programs, each year's success would actually be Russia behaving responsibly and becoming a cooperative partner, as it has been in the past on Afghanistan and the Balkans. We have very positive examples of a time when they did work with the international community. If things have gotten worse, I think we need to actually have a more fundamental relook at our prioritization of the Russia threat vis-a-vis other threats that the department and the government, U.S. government, have identified. In terms of how, your question about deconflicting and dialogue with Russia, again, the strategy is strong and balanced. So the balanced side of that is having a dialogue with Russia. Today, in fact, there's a NATO-Russia Council meeting. It's the second since 2014 when we said no business as usual and actually stopped the military-to-military cooperation under the business as usual rubric. So we do continue that dialogue, not least in Syria, where it's very important that we talk with them to avoid miscalculation. And every time they have a violation of airspace or fly too close to our ships, we also call out that bad behavior, because the last thing we need is miscalculation or an accident.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I, as I yield back, I'd just like to make the point that I would view continued escalation to be a failure, and I would hope that, and maybe working through the committee staff, the ranking member and the chair, there would be some way to hold a joint hearing with our colleagues on foreign affairs, because I'd really like to understand everything that we're doing to address these issues militarily, but also non-militarily. And nothing that I can think of condones Russia's behavior in the areas that we've talked about, but there is a logic to it, and I can understand them responding to the growth of NATO, to things that happened in Ukraine, a part of the world that's central to the Russian psyche. And the responses, while not justified, are understandable to me. And in that same way, I want to make sure we're thinking through adding $3.4 billion to the fire, bringing more forces in, and potentially setting us on a trajectory where we will be obligated, as things continue to escalate, to bring more forces and more dollars into play, thereby provoking additional responses that may not be wise, they may not follow the international norms, but may follow a logic that we've seen play out from Georgia to Ukraine to east to Crimea, and so anyhow, I just like to set that out there. Really appreciate your all's work and response to our questions. With that, I yield back to the chair.
Ma'am, do you have any thoughts? I want to thank all of you for being here. It's very clear to me that we need your expertise, and the other thing that's clear to me from this hearing is that Putin, he may be predictable sometimes, and at other times unpredictable, but he clearly would not have stopped in the Ukraine, in my opinion, had the United States not shown the resolve, and had our NATO allies not shown the resolve that they did to stop him. And so we'll have honest and respectful discussions about the funding of the operations in that part of the world. Look forward to your input on that, and look forward to making the world a better place. With that, we're adjourned.